everyone, welcome back to Unshaken and Unashamed. If you're new here, hi, my name is Chatty and this channel is really just a space for honest conversations about faith. Not the polished highlight reel version of faith, not the kind that pretends everything is easy and perfectly put together, but it's the kind of faith that exists in real life. You know, when things feel messy, confusing, overwhelming, and sometimes even a little discouraging. Because if we're honest for a moment, following Jesus doesn't suddenly make life simple, you know? In fact, sometimes it makes you more aware of things you didn't notice before. You start noticing your reactions more. You notice your thought life more. You notice the gap between the person you want to be and the person you sometimes still are. And when you start seeing that gap more clearly, it can sometimes lead to an uncomfortable feeling, shame. You start thinking things like, why am I still struggling with this? Shouldn't I be further along by now? And how can I talk about faith when I'm still such a work in progress? And that tension is actually one of the reasons the book of Romans is so powerful and one of my favorite books in the Bible. It's because Romans doesn't pretend that people are naturally perfect. It takes a very honest look at the human condition, our struggles, our failures, our need for grace. But at the same time, it gives one of the clearest and most beautiful explanations of the gospel in the entire Bible. And today we're looking at one of the most famous statements Paul makes in this letter, Romans chapter 1, verse 16. Paul writes, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes." Now, at first glance, that sentence might not seem all that dramatic. Why is she talking about it, But the more you sit with it, the more interesting it becomes. Paul didn't say, "I love the gospel." He didn't say, "I believe the gospel." He said, "I am not ashamed of the gospel." Which raises the question, right? Why would someone be ashamed of the gospel in the first place? Clearly, Paul thinks that's a real possibility. And when you understand the world he was writing into, it makes a whole lot more sense. Paul was writing to believers in Rome. It was the center of the most powerful empire in the ancient world. Rome valued power. Rome valued influence. Rome valued status and strength and prestige. The gospel, on the other hand, told a very different kind of story. It said that the Lord of the world was a man who had been crucified. Now, today the cross is a symbol of hope and faith. But in the first century, crucifixion was one of the most humiliating forms of execution imaginable. It was used by the Roman Empire to publicly shame criminals and rebels. It was brutal, it was degrading, and it was meant to send a message. So imagine standing in that culture and saying, the person we believe is the true king was executed on a Roman cross. Now, to many people in that world, that sounded just downright ridiculous, right? It sounded weak. It sounded embarrassing. And in another letter, Paul even says that the message of the cross is foolishness to many people. It didn't sound impressive. It didn't sound powerful. It sounded like a failure. And yet Paul says, "I am not ashamed." Why? Because Paul understood something that people often miss. Because what looks weak on the surface is actually where God's power is revealed. And the gospel completely flips our expectations of power. God didn't conquer the world through military strength. He didn't establish his kingdom through political domination. He came through humility, through suffering, through sacrifice, through the cross. The cross looked like defeat, but it was actually the moment of victory. And that's why Paul says the gospel is the power of God for salvation. Not good advice, not a motivational speech, power. And that distinction really matters because a lot of people assume Christianity is basically a message about self-improvement, Like the goal is to try harder, be nicer, follow the rules, be a better person. But the gospel is not primarily advice. It's a statement. It's an announcement. It's the announcement that something has already happened. It's the announcement that Jesus lived, Jesus died, Jesus rose again, and through him, forgiveness and new life are available. That's why Paul calls it power, because the gospel doesn't just inform people, it transforms people. It changes their whole relationship with God. It changes their identity. It changes the direction of their life. And Paul actually knew this better than almost everyone. Because before he followed Jesus, Paul was one of the most aggressive opponents of Christianity. He persecuted believers. He approved of their arrests. He believed the Christian movement was dangerous and needed to be stopped. But everything changed when he encountered the risen Jesus. The man who once tried to destroy the church became one of its most passionate missionaries. The man who once imprisoned Christians eventually wrote letters to encourage them in their walk with God. And that's not a small lifestyle change. That is a complete life transformation. And Paul attributes that transformation to the power of the gospel. So when he says he isn't ashamed, he's not saying the gospel is socially impressive. He's saying it's spiritually powerful. And if we're honest, sometimes we still feel that tension today. Maybe not because we're afraid of persecution, but maybe because we're afraid of being misunderstood. Maybe we're going to worry what people will think of us. Maybe they'll think we're naive or overly religious or judgmental or out of touch with the world. So sometimes we soften things. We avoid certain conversations. We keep our faith quiet in certain environments like work. And sometimes the shame isn't even about other people. Sometimes it's internal. It sounds more like this. How can I talk about Jesus when I still struggle with sin? How can I represent God when my life isn't perfect? And how can I speak about faith when I still have doubts? But those questions assume something that isn't actually true. They assume the credibility of the gospel depends on our perfection. But it doesn't. The power of the gospel does not come from flawless Christians. It comes from a perfect Savior. Because if the gospel required perfect representatives, the message would have disappeared a long time ago. Instead, throughout the Bible, God consistently works through imperfect, sinful people. Abraham doubted, Moses felt inadequate, David failed morally, Peter denied Jesus, and yet God still used them. Which means the gospel has never been about showcasing perfect people, because we're not perfect people. It's about revealing a perfect God who shows grace to imperfect people. And that leads directly into the next verse. Romans chapter 1 verse 17 says, "For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last." And this verse is incredibly important because for a long time people assumed righteousness was something you had to earn. You obeyed enough rules, you performed enough religious duties, you tried hard enough, and maybe eventually you yourself would become righteous enough for God. But Paul says something very, very different. Righteousness comes by faith, which means it's not something that you slowly build, it's something that you receive. And that changes everything about our relationship with God, because it means your acceptance by God does not fluctuate based on how well your week went, how well you did throughout your day. It's grounded in what Jesus has already done. And when you understand that, something shifts. You stop relating to God primarily through fear. You stop hiding every time you mess up. You stop believing your failures automatically disqualify you. Instead, you begin trusting that the same grace that saved you is also the same grace that will continue transforming you. And that's why shame loses its power in the gospel. Shame says, you failed too many times, you're too inconsistent, you should hide. But the gospel says, come closer, and that is the beauty of this message. The gospel is not a story about how impressive we are. It's a story about how powerful and gracious Jesus is. So if you've ever felt hesitant to talk about your faith, or you're unsure whether you're good enough to represent Jesus, or worried that your struggles make you a bad example, remember this. The gospel was never about showing the world how perfect you are. It's about pointing people to the one who is. Now, thank you so much for being here today. In the next episode, we're going to talk about something really important from Romans chapter 3, which is why every human being needs saving, and why that truth is actually far more beautiful and far more hopeful than it sounds. And yeah, so if this episode encouraged you, feel free to share it with someone who might need to hear it. And as always, stay unshaken, stay unashamed, and I'll see you in the next episode.